A stone corridor before dawn, the air cold and carrying the faint smell of tallow and old wood smoke. A monk lifts a candle close to his face, not to read by it, but to examine a cord wrapped around the taper, running his thumb along the wax until he finds a knot. He counts silently, then sets the candle back in its holder and returns to wait. He is the only one awake in a building full of sleeping men. His single duty is to know when it is time. Before mechanical clocks, before the familiar face on a tower wall, before the tick of anything at all, the question of what time it was could be surprisingly difficult to answer. For most people in the early medieval world, time moved in wide, unstructured stretches. The pale light before sunrise, the full warmth of midday, the long cooling toward dark. That was enough for most lives. Crops, cattle, and sleep did not require minutes. But monastic life required something more exacting. The rule of St. Benedict, written in the 6th century in central Italy, laid out a structure for communal religious life that depended entirely on gathering the whole community at fixed moments throughout the day and night, 8 times in all, for prayer. These were the canonical hours: lauds at dawn, prime at the 1st hour, terce at the 3rd, sext at the 6th, none at the 9th, vespers toward evening, compline before sleep, and then matins in the deep of the night. Each required every monk to stop what he was doing, file into the church, and pray together. The repetition was the point, the gathering, the shared rhythm of devotion, 8 times a day without exception. To miss an hour was to let the whole structure loosen. And so the question of time, reliable, consistent, manageable time, became a genuine practical concern. Someone had to know when to ring the bell. And here is something worth pausing on. Medieval hours were not the same length as ours. The custom was to divide the daylight into 12 hours and the night into 12, regardless of the season, which meant that a summer hour stretched long, perhaps 80 of our minutes in a northern European June, while a midwinter hour was brief and grey, closer to 40 minutes. The hours were always 12. The sun filled them differently depending on where it stood in the year. To mark these hours with any consistency, monks turned to instruments inherited from the ancient world. The clepsydra, a water clock, a vessel designed so that water dripped at a measured rate from one container into another, had been in use since antiquity, and monasteries maintained them. The principle was sound enough. A slow, steady drip traced the passage of time into the rising level of water below. In mild indoor conditions, it worked reasonably well. Cold was the enemy. A stone monastery in northern England or the Rhineland was very cold, and cold thickened water and slowed the clock's drip. In genuine frost, the whole thing stopped. Candles filled the gap. A candle of a known size and consistent composition burns at a roughly predictable rate, and monks learned to mark their tapers with lines scored into the wax, or with knotted cords threaded through the taper, so that when the flame reached a knot, a measured portion of time had passed. This practice is noted across several monastic and historical sources, though the precise forms it took varied between houses and are not always fully recorded. It was imperfect, and any monk who depended on it would have known that. But the aim was not perfect precision so much as reliable rhythm, a consistent beat the community could live against. On clear days, sundials served. Small portable dials or scratched lines on south-facing walls allowed a sacristan to read the shadow of a peg and know roughly where the day had arrived. These scratch dials still survive on old English church walls, shallow, worn grooves in the stone easily missed by a passing eye that once guided a hand to the hour. Together, water, wax, and shadow made up a kind of timekeeping craft. Patient, observational, and never quite exact, but workable enough to gather a community 8 times a day and hold a rhythm across centuries. When the timekeeper had made his judgment, when the knot had been reached or the water had fallen to its mark, he rang the bell. And the bell was everything. Its sound did not stay within the monastery walls. A large bell carries a long distance across open country, And in the medieval landscape, with few competing sounds, the canonical bell rolled outward across fields and orchards, over the rooftops of nearby villages, into the mill and the forge and the barn. Most communities in the countryside had no clock of their own. The monastery bell was, in practice, the nearest thing to a public clock that many people would ever encounter. The word noon carries a piece of this history inside it. The canonical hour of none was named for the 9th hour of the day. Mid-afternoon by our reckoning, roughly 3 in the afternoon on a summer schedule. But over the medieval centuries, none appears to have gradually migrated earlier in the day. Historians suggest that fasting monks, hungry after a long morning of labor and prayer, may have slowly shifted the main meal, which followed none, toward the middle of the day, and the office followed the meal. By the High Middle Ages, none had arrived at midday and stayed there. The word came with it and has stayed ever since. Every time anyone says noon, they are carrying a small, ancient piece of monastic time, though almost no one knows it. The bell reshaped more than language. It divided the working day for people who had no other measurement. Laborers in monastery fields knew by the bell when their morning had begun and roughly when they might rest. Merchants in towns close to large abbeys oriented their transactions around the canonical rings. The monks had not intended this, they were ringing for God. Not for commerce, but the consequence settled into the surrounding world steadily. The way a consistent sound settles into a place until it becomes part of how that place is understood. Of all the canonical hours, matins was the hardest to manage. The night office required the whole community to rise in the deep of the night, well before dawn, in the coldest and quietest part, assemble in the unheated church, and sing the long night prayers before returning to their beds for a few final hours before Lord's at dawn. This was not occasional, it was every night, in every season, for the whole of a monk's life. Someone had to wake the others. In many monasteries, a single monk was appointed as the night watcher, sleeping lightly or not sleeping at all, responsible for monitoring the candle or the water clock, and then moving through the dormitory at the correct hour to rouse the community. This role appears in various monastic customaries, the practical collections of house rules that individual communities compiled to govern their daily operations. The exact arrangements are not always clearly documented. The records tend to be thinnest for the most ordinary and taken for granted parts of daily life, the tasks so routine that no one thought to explain them. On clear nights, some monks read the stars. The position of certain constellations can tell a practiced observer what hour the night has reached, and it is plausible, though not always precisely documented, that monks in open-skied northern monasteries made use of this. There is something very old in that image, a man standing in a stone cloister, breath clouding in the cold air, face tilted to the winter sky, reading the same constellations that ancient farmers and sailors had read long before him, putting that old skill into the service of a fixed and regular prayer. Other methods were more improvised. Some sources mention oil lamps floated in bowls of water, arranged to sink slowly as water seeped through small holes, a rough timer of a kind. The evidence for any single method is scattered, and practices clearly varied between houses and across regions. What was consistent across all of them was a quality of sustained attention, a deliberate, practiced watchfulness toward time itself, as if time were something that had to be held carefully, or it would slip. Mechanical clocks began appearing in European towers in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, heavy iron-framed devices driven by falling weights, their gears grinding slowly in tower chambers, their bells audible across a wide stretch of town. They kept imperfect time by modern standards, needed regular adjustment, and broke down with some frequency. But they could function in the cold. They did not gutter in a draught, and they required no one to stay awake beside them through the night. Monasteries took to them readily. The mechanical clock solved practical problems that had always been present: the freezing clepsydra, the candle disturbed by a draught, the watcher who slept too deeply. The tools changed, the practice of the hours continued. But something had already settled into the world long before the first iron clock was cast. Centuries of regular bell ringing had deposited an idea. The idea that a day was not simply a long, undivided flow from light to dark, but a measured thing, divisible into units, something one could be expected to keep. That idea had spread outward from the cloister into the daily lives of people who had never taken any vow. It settled into wage arrangements and market customs, into guild schedules, and the expectations of courts and councils. It found its way, eventually, into the deep modern sense that time is a quantity, something we have and can use or waste. The monks had meant to prey on time. What they built, over centuries of cold mornings and careful candle watching, was the habit of measured time itself. Somewhere tonight, a church bell rings in the distance, its sound softened by air and trees and the dark. The monk who once counted knots in the small hours is long gone. The water clock is dry. The knotted candle has burned down to nothing, and the wax is cold. But the bell still rings, more or less on the hour, because once a community of quiet, careful, devoted people decided that the hour mattered, and they were patient enough and attentive enough to keep it. That patience found its way into the world and has never quite left. Rest now. The hours will keep themselves tonight.